It's the Musicalist for Friday, June 27th. I'm Phil Oliver. Earlier this month, New York City was abuzz with an unprecedented event. For 11 days, under the auspices of the New York Philharmonic, audiences were treated to a massive array of new music. The Biennial, as it was called and presumably will be called again in 2 years, featured performances by the New York Phil, as well as the American Composers Orchestra, the Gotham Chamber Opera, the Bang on a Can All-Stars, and Juilliard Opera. Perhaps one of the most visible events of the Biennial was the premiere of a new symphony by the New York Phil's composer-in-residence, Christopher Rouse. What you're hearing now is the first of two movements. The second movement takes us to another place entirely. Before we got around to talking about his Fourth Symphony, I asked Rouse for his take on the Biennial itself. So your Fourth Symphony, it was premiered as part of the New York Phil's first ever Biennial Festival, and this was 11 days starting on May 28th of concerts comprised primarily of new music, and aside from the New York Phil, there were also performances by the American Composers Orchestra, Bang on a Can, and the Gotham Chamber Opera did an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. That was with music by Toshio Hosokawa. I was wondering if you got a chance to see some of these concerts and what your overall impression of the Biennial was.
Oh, sure. I went to a number of them. Unfortunately, I had a bad cold, so I was coughing through it all. I had to keep kind of going into the hallway to really let loose before I could come back in and try to be quiet. Sure. I mean, there were all sorts of things. They did the Gruber Opera also. That Alan Gilbert conducted, Gloria, A Pig's Tale with the Juilliard Axiom Ensemble, and Orchestra St. Luke's did a couple of things, and so on. Yeah, I mean, it was all sorts of music, except for the one piano recital that tried to show some connections from Franz Liszt to more contemporary music. Everything was pretty recent. Mm-hmm. And it was, I mean, nobody is going to like everything, but it really was a mixture of what's going on in Europe. There was a program devoted to young American composers, readings, and so forth. Three of the Red composers got their pieces played on the concerts of June 5th, 6th, and 7th. So, yeah, I think it was certainly an artistic success, no question about it.
Mm-hmm. And how was the turnout? Was it pretty like
well,
what you expected?
One would always hope for more.
Yeah.
but the turnout was certainly decent.
Okay. And did you get to interact a lot with younger composers, or did they pretty much stay at the kids' table for the most part?
Well, with the readings, sure, we were interacting with them and mentoring them, as the folks who run the readings would like to call it. Uh-huh. And also the contact concert that was down at Subculture was, when I say young American composers, I mean composers who are emerging or have already kind of pretty much emerged, rather than starting composers. But sure, there's lots of interaction.
Okay, great. And so the concert where your Fourth Symphony was premiered, you were actually sharing that with two other world premieres. One was by Julia Adolph, and also the New York premiere of Peter Utvush's Do Re Mi, kind of a violin concerto. And then your symphony came last on the program. Now, be honest, was that awkward at all?
Well, it's not a terribly long piece, so it was a short second half and kind of a short concert, perhaps. But no, since the programming was all contemporary music, something new had to come last, and it turned out to be my piece. And on Saturday, when they repeated it, there was a different work. Max Graf composed a work called Bismuth that opened the Saturday program as one of the other winning composers from the readings. No, so the ending of the piece is very quiet. It's not kind of a whoopee Hellraiser kind of work. So I think people's feelings are a little bit muted at the end, but no, it was fine for them to put it there wherever they wanted to.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do want to come back to the ending of the piece in a second, but just in terms of did the stakes feel higher when you have 3 living composers all in the same room versus just one surrounded by maybe a Beethoven symphony and like a Rossini overture like you normally get?
Well, I never thought of it, but I'd have to say no.
Okay.
Not really.
So I wanted to quote from your program notes for the Fourth Symphony. You wrote, quote, "Sometimes composers have a great deal to say about their expressive intent in a given musical work. At other times, they've had little, if anything, to say. Before this symphony, I probably would have put you in the previous category, but with this piece, I mean, you acknowledge that there is some underlying programmatic element, but this time you've opted to play your cards kind of close to the bosom, so to say. So I'm wondering if this marks a definitive shift in attitude for you, or if it's something you just...
No. This was a piece I had to write. I was impelled to write, but it's a very personal and private piece, and one that whose quote-unquote meaning I'll just keep to myself and let each listener decide for him or herself what it might mean. There are other pieces of mine where I've had little to say. There's a work from the late 80s called Iscariot, where I'm rather cryptic. But often these pieces are ones that are not public statements in any way. I'm basically not a believer in the idea that you spend your whole life writing music, creating any art, only to please yourself, and who cares what anyone else thinks. I really don't believe in that. I believe that art has to be communicative, and to make a real attempt to be communicative. But sometimes, once in a while, it's not that I'm trying not to be communicative, but sometimes I feel that I've just got to write this piece. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what people are going to think of it. I posted on Facebook the day of the premiere that I thought a lot of people would find it a head-scratcher. And I think some people have found it a head-scratcher, but that's fine. That's okay.
Sure.
But it doesn't elicit from me any further clarification.
I wanted to comment, though, because there's such a stark organization to the symphony. We go, quite linearly from this fast and festive music in the high register, and then almost exactly halfway through, we end up going to this very dark place with low strings and contrabassoon, muted low brass, and gongs, and then the piece is over. And for anyone who knows your second symphony, for example, we might have expected the festive music to come back, but in fact that doesn't happen. So, I personally found it to be a pretty poignant gesture, but other people, let's say, particularly in the New York Times, were not impressed. So I'm wondering if that was something you had planned all along, or if it was something that happened spontaneously as the piece was being written.
No, it was planned that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, because there's such a spontaneity to your music, and I've always wondered whether you tend to work from a chart or whether you rely more on sort of generative processes that come into play as you're writing a piece.
Well, I always have to have some kind of... I don't sketch physically, but I do mentally. So I have to have some idea in my mind of the overall shape of the piece, what it's trying to say, what it's about on an expressive level. And then I can kind of get going with the actual writing of the piece, even though there's still going to be lots of decisions to be made along the way. But I could never start a piece blind, not knowing anything about the form or where it's going or whatnot. So I always had the two-movement. My third symphony is also a two-movement symphony, but quite different. And I like the two-movement form, just kind of yin and yang or fast and slow or whatever, however you want to describe it. But I always knew that this piece would be the way it is, basically, before I put the first note on the page.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found it interesting that you mentioned you don't really sketch things out physically, and I had come across you saying that before. I think right before your first symphony was premiered, that was, I think, David Zinman guest conducting in Chicago about 20 years ago, and you had this interesting comment to the effect that, you basically said the same thing, that you don't typically sketch things out on paper, you do it mentally for the most part, and then what you end up writing down is, in fact, the more or less final version of whatever it is you're composing. And
right.
I had always wondered if, since then, like if the advances in notation software have changed that at all, or do you still work pretty much the same way?
No, because I still do it by hand, everything by hand, and I'm an old dinosaur, so I don't use music notation software at all. I send the written manuscript off to my publisher, and then they, of course, have someone put it into computer file format.
Okay, so like Boozy has these in-house copyists that do all that then?
Right.
Okay.
They just get my handwritten manuscript and go from there.
I see. You also mentioned your third symphony. I think it's so interesting that you wrote it just 2 years previous to this one, and it also had this kind of unusual formal component. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the third one is the one where you kind of took this theme and variations idea from Prokofiev's Second Symphony.
Right. A kind of a staccato-like allegro first movement, and then a second movement that's theme and variations. Right. I mean, the Prokofiev Second, which is rarely played, is perhaps my favorite of the whole cycle of seven. It's such a dynamic and inventive and imaginative piece. The first movement is pretty aggressive, and I think it maybe scares some people away, but good Lord, I mean, we've certainly come to accept and even love the Rite of Spring, so I don't see why the Prokofiev Second has to hold any terrors for anyone.
I'm wondering if, in retrospect, are you aware of a kind of shared creative impulse between your third and fourth symphonies, insofar as the structure is concerned? Because I know your first and second symphonies also were conceived, as you've said, almost simultaneously, and the fact that the third and fourth both are two movement and have this sort of non-conventional structure to them seems like there might be some shared creative impulse, I guess.
Afraid not. Sorry. No, it just kind of so happened that way.
Okay.
No, they're really. Besides the fact that there are two movements in each of the symphonies, I can't really think of much of anything that would unite them.
Each of your first three symphonies contains some reference to another composer. Shostakovich seems to appear pretty frequently. In fact, in the first symphony, I think you pretty deliberately used his famous monogram tetrachord, the DSCH,
right.
And we already mentioned Prokofiev in the third symphony. So I wanted to hear directly from you if there are any such references or influences at play in your fourth symphony.
Well, it wasn't necessarily a conscious one, but in hearing it, the first movement has some moments that do sound a bit like early Tippett, and I do love Tippett's music. So I wouldn't call it a conscious homage to Tippett, but I think maybe I'm mining the same, working in the same mine as he was in his earlier years, not so much in his later works. But other than that, and the second movement, no, I can't really think of any other composer that the music related to in my mind. Okay.
Well, over the years, you've had such a really terrific relationship with the New York Phil. This past year, they also premiered your piece Prospero's Rooms, which you described as kind of an overture to an unwritten opera. That if you had written the opera, it would have been influenced by Edgar Allan Poe. A story along similar lines. And this past spring, they did the New York premiere of your Requiem. Right. And then way back in 1992, when I was all of 1 year old, so I don't remember this, but they premiered your trombone concerto with Joe Alessi, and it ended up winning a Pulitzer the following year.
That's right. Yeah. And they also premiered Seeing, my piano and orchestra piece, I think in 1999, I want to say, with Emanuel Axe. So between the premieres and just all the other performances, they played a lot of my music, and they play it magnificently.
Mm-hmm. Do they feel like family at this point then?
Well, they certainly, they don't, they know what I want. I have less and less to say each time, because I know that they're going to get it, and Alan Gilbert, of course, is wonderful. He knows what I'm after, without my saying it, and for a composer, that's a wonderful thing if a composer can develop that kind of relationship with a performer or performers, be they conductors or instrumentalists or whatever, where you just are on the same wavelength, and you just don't need to explain yourself. They'll do what you want them to do without you saying anything, because they're so in tune with the music. So it's and I've had the good fortune of establishing relationships like that with several conductors, and it's a really wonderful experience for me.
Yeah. So this time around, did you have? Was there much to do in the way of rehearsals, or did they pretty much kind of know what you were after?
Well, there wasn't a lot of rehearsal time. Just the nature of the biennial was such that they were doing so many things. And of course, on the 5th and 7th, they played one program with my symphony and the Utfisch, but with different opening pieces those 2 nights. And on the 6th, they did a completely different program with Matthias Pincher conducting a large work of his, and the New York premiere of one of the last pieces Elliott Carter wrote, and again another one of the reading composer winners. So they were working very hard, and incredibly hard, and there just wasn't enough. No, let me take that back. That's not the right way to say it. There was not the usual amount of rehearsal time because of the very different programs that they were playing from night to night. But they did a marvelous job.
Yeah, I thought so. I mean, I listened to the live stream online. I couldn't make it out to the concert, but yeah, I mean, it took maybe like 10 seconds for the strings to really get into that really substantial beginning, but then after that, it just seems to go off without a hitch.
Yeah, I wonder if that was the Thursday or the Saturday one. Usually things get better as you go along. You may have heard the very first one.
Yeah, I think
on Thursday, because they pretty much nailed it on Saturday.
Mm-hmm. Well, this year marks the 2nd year already of your role as composer in residence with the New York Phil, and in fact, they just extended your residency for another year through 2015. So could you give us a sampling of some of the projects you have coming up? I know they're going to do another premiere in October.
They'll do a premiere right in October, a piece that I've already completed, which is called Thunderstruck, not struck, but stuck, which is kind of reflects my love of the continuing love of the rock and roll that I grew up with in the 1960s and 70s. Mm-hmm. And then next year they're also doing the flute concerto, the New York premiere of the flute concerto, which is kind of amazing considering that piece has gotten hundreds of performances. But
right, it seems long overdue. Like
I know.
I always just assumed it had been done already in New York.
No, never in New York. Isn't that funny? And there are 4 commercial recordings and blah blah blah. But it has awaited its New York premiere until now, and then they're also doing Iscariot. So another full plate for me.
You can find a full recording of Rouse's 4th Symphony, plus additional information about the man himself, at the podcast website, themusicalist.net. Send your comments, questions, and suggestions via Twitter at @the_musicalist, our Facebook page, or email contact@themusicalist.net. The Musicalist gets support from its listeners and from Archive Music, now through July 7th, offering 50% off recordings from major labels, including Decca, Philips, and Deutsche Grammophon. Archive Music, the source for classical music. You've been listening to The Musicalist. Tune in next week when I'll be talking with composer Mohammed Fairouz about the recent release of his 3rd symphony on the Sonoluminous label, as well as a new oratorio that'll be premiered next year. Until then, I'm Phil Oliver. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.